speaker is Mr. Serhat Guvenc. He is professor at Kadir Khas University, and he is speaking about the significance of Lemnos in the Gallipoli campaign, the Turkish perspective.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank Lemnos Part6 Professor Varos and Zis for inviting me to this very honored event. It was an opportunity that I could not pass up, and I will always treasure to be here. I have to begin with a certain confession that I'm not a historian by training. I'm married to one dog, and this doesn't make me a historian. And as a Turkish academic, very early in my career, I identified 3 potential minefields which I decided to, evade or avoid. One was terrorism, the other one was the Middle East, and the third one was the Gallipoli Wars. Unfortunately, you can ride, you can run, but you cannot hide. So I ended up talking about all these 3 subjects eventually. And that reminds me of Leon Trotsky's famous proposition. You may not be interested in war, but the war is interested in you. Therefore, I may not be interested in the Gallipoli Wars, but obviously the war was interested in me. My association with the Gallipoli Wars began with a book project. 10 years ago, the Commander-in-Chief of the Turkish Navy at the time asked me to put together a book on the story of 2 Ottoman dreadnoughts which had been commanded by Winston Churchill very shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. Then my interest in Turkish naval aviation also brought me indirectly to the Gallipoli campaign. During my presentation, although the focus is supposed to be on Lemnos, the 2 dreadnoughts and plus the 2 German warships that were purchased nominally by the Ottoman Empire may figure unnecessarily prominently, so please forgive this bias. Yeah. And dear translators, I get excited really quickly and I may get carried away, so please bear with me. But everything will be on the screen, okay? Okay. This is a picture I took in 2009 when I visited the French Military Museum. The flag says the gallery to the 2 world wars. And to my best knowledge, the first one began in earnest in 1914. But according to French interpretation, 1871 was the beginning of the 2 great wars or 2 world wars. So by simple logic, I said, what would be a similar beginning of the World War I for the Turks? Well, personally, I would pick, the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877-78, which ushered in a period of tension and conflict, and the Ottomans lost huge territories in the European part of the empire, provinces in the east, Romania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Cyprus was supposedly leased to Great Britain. And more importantly, it was a turning point because London gave up on the Ottoman Empire. London began to see Ottoman Empire doomed to collapse and disintegrate. Though it intervened to overturn some Russian gains and Bulgarian gains at the Berlin Congress, the arrangement, the Berlin arrangement, indeed added to the appetite of the newly independent Balkan nations and sowed the seeds of the future conflict. Well, a few highlights in the Ottoman route to the war. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which was followed by the adoption of the second constitution. But around the same time, Austria-Hungary finally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was a huge territorial loss, and followed by loss of Crete in 1909. And all these developments indeed contributed to the extreme militarization of the state and society in the empire. And as such, military and naval rejuvenation or revival began to make sense not only to the statesmen but the public at large, especially in the capital city. So a series of attempts to reform the services of the Ottoman Empire took place. A British naval mission was invited to Constantinople in 1909. A naval building program was adopted, and it was complemented by the arrival of a German military mission in December 1913. Well, the road the Ottoman entry to the war, the navalism was important. The the Ottomans turned naval-minded, especially after the loss of Crete. It was not immune, the Ottoman society was not immune to the 20th century navalism or naval-mindedness. And they set up, the individuals set up a naval league to support naval building with individual subscription. This created a channel for Ottoman individuals to identify with the ships that would be ordered for their navies in the future. Well, regional naval arms were abundant at the time. You know, the most commonly known, best known examples were in South America, involving Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And in the Near East, it involved Ottoman Empire, Russia, and Greece. And Winston Churchill never approved such regional naval arms races. He despised such races, and he considered them, you know, I mean, in his words, it's a sport for them, it is that for us. As for regional naval arms races, you know, in the Aegean, the Ottoman Empire was pitted against Greece, and the previous speaker mentioned some of the aspects of it. The naval balance in the Aegean was changed in favor of Greece with the acquisition of protected cruiser Varos in 1909 from Italy. The Ottomans tried to counter that by purchasing two obsolete Brandenburg pre-dreadnought battleships in 1910, and those ships were named to Guthries and Varos was lost at the Dardanelles. In their statement, the British naval mission in Istanbul suggested the purchase of HMS Triumph and HMS Swiftsure. Well, these are the pictures or postcards from the period. You know, this one is Varos, Varos and Swiftsure. The Ottoman dreadnoughts, you know, they became important issues. Initially, in 1911, the Ottomans ordered two dreadnoughts, but due to lack of funds, only one could be laid, and it was named Reshadiye. It was supposed to be completed in September 1913, a year before the outbreak of the First World War. The Russians also launched their own naval building program, and Duma, the Russian parliament, approved building of three Empress Maria-class battleships for the Black Sea Fleet in 1911, and those were to be the first example of which would be commissioned in 1915. As for the Greek dimension, you know, Greece ordered a battle cruiser from Germany named Salamis. Interestingly, its main armament was ordered from a U.S. company, Bethlehem Steel Works, and I'll come back to the story of these guns at the end of my presentation. Well, the Balkan Wars was yet another important turning point, and it added to the frustration of the Ottomans. You know, it turned the population anti-militarist and extremely nationalist because of the huge Turkish Muslim population displacement. Millions of Muslims had to be relocated or had to be resettled in the other parts of the empire. And the Ottomans fared miserably during the Balkan campaign, but the last push enabled them to recover what was left of the Eastern Thrace, including Edirne in 1930. And during this war, there was no significant Ottoman naval activity, and the islands in the Aegean fell into the Greek hands one by one. The Lemnos, the island we are on, was the first one, which was captured by the Greek forces on 21st of October 1912. The aftermath of Balkan Wars, the plight of refugees from the Balkans reinforced the sense of nationalism and added fuel to the militarization of the society. And after the Balkan Wars, there was this mindset which suggested that only might makes right. So you have to be powerful in order to defend your rights. And Anatolia began to emerge, began to bloom as the principal homeland for the Turks. However, another idea took root was that the Ottomans should capture the Aegean Islands by force. This is the cover of a very popular magazine of the time. And the subtitle here reads, "Right makes might, but can only be defended by the might in or of steel." So, pointing to the necessity of acquiring steel battleships. Therefore, during the Balkan Wars, the British shipyard makers suspended the building of Reshadiye, for fear that the Ottomans would never be able to pay the installments for the ship, but they did, even at the time of war, the Ottomans did not miss a single payment for the ship. Anyway, so the delays in Rejadiye's building, prompted the Ottomans to look for, other options. And at the time, the world's the biggest, not necessarily the mightiest dreadnought, was up for sale. The Brazilians, who nearly went bankrupt due to a drop in the coffee prices, were looking for new customers for that ship, and it was she would provide her owner with an edge in the seas. And the Russians, the Greeks, and the Ottomans were in competition to get their hands on her. While Ottomans managed to outbid Greeks and Russians because they were ready to commit an overpriced amount, 3 million pounds for the battleship in December 1913. The price was higher than the price of an oil-burning HMS Queen Elizabeth class super dreadnought. And they were able to outbid their rivals because they offered really high interest rates to French bankers, and the French could not resist the temptation to loan money to the Ottomans. On the eve of the First World War, there were several more additions to the Ottoman naval program. 2 dreadnoughts were already building. A third one was ordered in April 1914 to be named Fatih. Added to supposedly, the orders will include 2 protected cruisers, 2 destroyers, 2 submarines, and also 2 submarines were ordered in France in addition to those vessels ordered in British shipyards. The purpose of the naval building remained, up to this point, recapture of the Aegean Islands. That was a preoccupation. And the Ottoman public was fascinated by big battleships because they were the symbols of the revival of the empire and the empire's regaining great power status. And therefore, the public was awaiting their arrival anxiously. Well, just 2 weeks before the Sarajevo assassination, the 3rd Ottoman dreadnought was laid, Fatih, officially laid, 11th of June. This is the first and last picture of that ship. In December 1913, I already mentioned, a Sender mission arrived and caused a crisis among the great powers. Particularly Russia was totally unhappy with the Ottoman decision to recruit a German general to oversee the army reform, and it was taken as a sign of growing German influence in the Ottoman military affairs. And for some, it represented yet another milestone in Ottomans' drift towards the war on the side of Germany. And here, some attributed this decision to Enver Pasha's personal choices, the Minister of War at the time. Well, at this point, I'm in a discussion of whether the First World War was a necessary war or a war of choice for the Ottoman empires. There is argument that the Turkish Ottoman public opinion was already heavily pro-German at the time. But the Ottoman decision makers, the Union of Progress leaders, they took great strides in enlisting support from other great powers. They probed for a possible potential for alliance with Britain, France, and even with Russians. But those attempts proved futile. So the Ottoman Empire was considered doomed anyway, and it would be a liability rather than an asset in the coming conflict. After the Sarajevo assassination, the Ottomans' attention or priorities shifted away from the Aegean to the Black Sea, and Russia joined the primacy in Ottoman threat perceptions. It was a power, it was the principal power to be deterred and defended against. To check the Russian ambitions, naval power was needed, and containing these Russian ambitions in the Black Sea hinged on the fate of the Ottoman dreadnoughts. And on August 2nd, 1914, Churchill embargoed Rejadiye and Sultan Osman. He prevented the delivery of these 2 dreadnoughts to the Ottomans. Well, the idea of commandeering the Ottoman dreadnought had a longer history. Churchill, aired the idea in 1912 during the Balkan Wars, but there was no supporters in the cabinet for the idea. This is the centerfold of London Illustrated News, and it says, the ships which might which might be added to our navy if war came now. This is Reshardi. And this is the battle cruiser Congo, which was built for Japan. Unfortunately, Churchill could not get his hands around her because she left British shipyards before the outbreak of the First World War. Well, embargo on the Ottoman dreadnoughts. A day before Churchill's decision, the Ottomans already concluded a secret alliance with Germany. A day later, Reshardi became HMS Erin and Sultan Osman became the HMS Agincourt. And the British decision turned the Ottoman public strongly anti-British. And what subsequently followed was one of the worst cases of PR crisis management exercises, I would say. Churchill's instructions to the British charge affair in Istanbul was very simple. Negotiate and temporize. That was it. And public reaction was, extremely furious. Just to read the last sentence of a letter by an average person, which was published in a Turkish paper: because you have saddened our hearts, God is punishing you and will punish you more through Germany. So that was the popular mindset in reaction to the decision. Well, the Ottomans lost 2 warships, but were compensated with the arrival of 2 German cruisers, 1 battle cruiser and 1 heavy cruiser. They were escaping from the British Mediterranean fleet. They showed up off the Dardanelles on the 7th of August, and they were allowed in on the 10th of August in 1914. And they were nominally commissioned as Yavuz, Sultan Selim, and Midi.
Bit slowly.
Okay. The Allied campaign, the original idea, provided for an Allied naval assault to be coordinated with a Greek amphibious landing involving 60,000 troops, as previous speaker elaborated extensively. But no Greek troops were available at the time of the campaign, so the only option that was left was a naval strike through the Dardanelles. And it was hoped that if the raid or if the strike was successful, the Ottoman capital would come within the range of naval guns, and the fragile Grand Turk regime would capitulate early on in the conflict, and this would, open the way for linking up with the Russians in the north. Well, the campaign was, kind of presented a challenge for the Brits because the resources were not there. The British dreadnoughts, the most modern British dreadnoughts, were needed elsewhere to check the German high sea fleet. Therefore, only obsolete battleships could be spared for the Gallipoli campaign. The only exception was the HMS Queen Elizabeth, of course. There are several reasons for this. Well, the Dardanelles did not constitute a decisive point of action for the Allies. It was not a center of gravity for their military campaigns. Therefore, it did not require heavy concentration of forces. And there was no element of strategic surprise. It was lost since the arrival of Guvenc and Breslau in August 1914. Well, the Ottomans had been on war footing since 1911, since the Italian-Ottoman War over Tripoli. The Ottoman defenses had been beefed up during the Balkan Wars in anticipation of a Greek assault. And the Ottomans did not contemplate any fleet action in case of an assault on the Dardanelles. Most Ottoman surface assets were committed to the north against the Russians, which was another priority. The big guns of the obsolete ships, such as the ironclad Mesudien, three dreadnoughts, Tubutrace and Varos, were used to augment the coastal batteries in the defenses. The mines, torpedoes, anti-submarine barriers, fortifications, and coastal artillery, complemented by small combatants, submarines, and aircraft, would be the principal weapons the Ottomans would fight or would use to defend against the invaders. Well, Allied forces. Well, before the campaign, the Ottoman Navy, under the command of German Captain Sushon, carried out a preemptive strike against the Russians on 29th of October 1914. So the idea was to cripple the Russians' navy so that the Ottomans could maintain some sort of naval superiority in the Black Sea until the arrival of Russian dreadnoughts. And by that time, it was hoped that the war would be over. Well, since Greece remained neutral, the Aegean islands, such as Lemnos, Tassos, Lesbos, Nikos, and Tenedos, could be placed at the disposal of the Allies. They were captured during the Balkan Wars, and the Ottomans did not yet recognize the Greek sovereignty over them. Therefore, technically, they were still the enemy territory or no man's land. They became the basis for, or staging areas for, the British naval and army units. This was the situation. This was a map of the Allied naval strike on the 18th of March 1915. The first and last time they tried to force the Dardanelles. This is an English representation. Here is a more colorful Turkish representation of what happened on that fateful day. I'm not going to the details of this strike. Well, the Allies were inflicted heavy losses. In other words, the Ottoman denial strategy worked against the Allies, and they lost major battleships in a single day. And losses at such level could not be sustained. HMS Irresistible, HMS Ocean, and French Guvenc sank. HMS Inflexible, Blue French Roi, and Suffren were damaged heavily. And the Ottoman mines and artillery accounted for these ship losses. It was followed by the naval withdrawal from the Straits. The amphibious phase came on the 25th of 1915. The Anzac landing, and they were countered by the 19th Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, later the founder of Mother Turkey. I have to mention, the German U-boats. The Allies had quite a number of submarines operating in the Sea of Marmara and the Dardanelles. The most successful of them was E-11. Indeed, I mean, it had several troops into the Sea of Marmara, and it inflicted heavy damage, and it caused suspension of shipment of troops by sea for some time. Well, the arrival of German U-boats in the theater indeed forced the Allies to retreat or to withdraw their precious naval assets further south around Lemnos, this island, after the loss of HMS Triumph, which had been offered to the Ottomans, and HMS Majestic in May 1950. This is a map showing the important places where naval engagements took place in the Sea of Marmara and in the Dardanelles. Let's see the air campaign. Aircraft, both land-based and naval employed from the very beginning. They were mostly used for reconnaissance and observation, as well as artillery spotting. The aviation did not play a decisive role on the land campaigns. There were no aces, and Allies enjoyed air superiority over the theater of operations. The Ottoman Turkish aviation units had 3 companies on strength. One was a German seaplane company. While as for Allied aviation, Royal Naval Air Service seaplanes launched the first known torpedo attack against surface targets, the Ottoman shipping in that case. The submarine campaigns before their rides into the Sea of Marmara were given rides in the back seats to observe, in the back seats of aircraft to observe anti-submarine defense nets from the air. And they were used in interdicting the Ottoman camel trains and ox-drawn carts, which were the only means of land transportation of supplies. Well, as for Lemnos, it was an island too far for the Ottomans. It remained within the striking range of their military and naval capabilities. There was no significant naval action out of the Dardanelles as a result of the naval blockade, which was laid on the 10th of August 1914. The military aircraft and naval aircraft at the time were too underpowered and sometimes unarmed or underarmed to carry out significant roles, but they were used in observation and surveillance flights. And those aircraft that could be used for long-range observation flights covering the island of Lemnos were mostly German the aircraft of the German seaplane company stationed in the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, to get information about the troop and naval movements, relied on local Greek spies. Because after the trade with the island, with the Ottoman mainland was cut off, they needed alternative sources of income. The fishers, the tradesmen, and there was a certain discontent with the British military rule on the island. Therefore, the Armenians were able to recruit some locals for information, and they provided more or less accurate information on the ship and troop movements on the islands. But sometimes their estimates were well off the mark. For instance, a source suggests that the number of Allied aircraft stationed on the island numbered around 100, which was, an overestimation. At best, I think there were 3 aircraft stationed at one point. The German Army aerial observation flights, I consulted the memoirs of Major Erisenno, which was the head of Ottoman Air Force or air units at the time. He mentions in his memoirs, quote, courageously foolhardy flights to islands far out in the Mediterranean, to Tenedos, Imbros, and even to Lemnos. So Lemnos was even, it was a target which was very difficult to reach in the underpowered and flimsily built land plains. And unquote. And another quote from him. Many of the island flights carried out on bright moonlit nights yielded good reconnaissance results. The number and composition of the warships and transports concentrated in the Bay of Mudros on Lemnos, the hiding place of the enemy fleet, could be confirmed accurately by these flights. These are the 2 aerial shots that came from the personal album of the commander of flight school at San Stefano, Yeşilköy, Mehmet Ali Okar. He was a friend of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He was a native of Thessaloniki, and they lived in the same neighborhood. So probably when he retired, he was presented an album, and he was an observer. He was trained as an observer in Germany. And I don't know who took these shots. I don't think he personally flew in those reconnaissance shots. But these, I'm not very proficient in Ottoman script, but it says, enemy bivouacs on the island of Lemnos. So these may be night shots as well, but these are not high resolution photos, therefore please forgive their poor quality. Aerial raids on Lemnos, very rare, but that doesn't mean it was never attempted. Very few, and they took place towards the end of the campaign, land campaign, when the Allies were evacuating from the Dardanelles. For instance, in December 1915, the German seaplane company aircraft dropped 32 bombs. They scored 17 direct hits on the enemy camps at Sebilbahir, which was on the peninsula, 2 on the supply sheds at Mudros. Okay? 1 on a hangar at Tenedos, and 4 on enemy ships. Insignificant tactically and operationally, but still, symbolically, they scored some hits in a target as far as Mudros Bay. Well, the Allies also used Mudros for their strategic bombing campaign. This was a significant attempt after the end of the naval and land phases of the campaign. The Brits deployed a giant Handley Page bomber to Lemnos in 1917. Its target was HMS Guvenc and Istinian. In most narratives I read about the Dardanelles campaigns, I get the impression that Churchill was personally obsessed with this battle cruiser. He was after her. So this is the Istinian Bay, where I live, very close to. The attack caused some casualties and great panic among the civilians, but there was no harm could be done to HMS Guvenc. A light Ottoman vessel was sank instead. A very vivid account of this raid can be found in a novel written by a Greek author, a resident of Istanbul. He wrote a novel on the eve of the Second World War. Theotokos, his last name, Leonis. And there's 2 pages dedicated, yes, Leonis, dedicated to his a witness account to the impact of an aerial raid on a big city at the time. So people were horrified. And the novel is based on his childhood memoirs, of course. So that was the only vivid description I've come across so far on the impact of this aid. Well, a few words on the Greek volunteers, and I owe this to my colleague, Professor Mesut Uyar. He emailed me these 2 pictures 2 days before I came here. The Greek volunteers, they were recruited by the French to be used in the campaign, but due to problems of coordination and cooperation, I guess they were assigned to other duties, including guarding the Ottoman prisoners of war. And when the Ottoman these pictures were taken at Sedr Bahir, but when they relocated the Ottoman prisoners of war, those Greek volunteers also came to the island. Well, one last episode was the only probably offensive action on the part of the Ottomans and Ottoman-German fleet. Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli. Midilli, by the way, was named after the island of Mytilene. So that was the extent of Ottoman desire, obsession with those islands. Well, they were supposed to launch a raid to relieve Allied pressure on the Palestinian front. Yavuz managed to send monitor HMS Lord Raglan. The idea was to extend the offensive operations all the way down to Lemnos, but they encountered problems in the very first stages. Midilli was lost totally. Yavuz received mine damage, but it managed to find its way into the Dardanelles, and Allied aircraft chased her and bombed her for 6 days. 200 bombs were dropped on her, only 2 scored, but the battle cruiser survived the mines and air raids to be commissioned in 1971 from the Turkish Republican Navy. Well, Yavuz and HMS Lord Raglan, I consider it as the settlement of an old account. It was an HMS Abercrombie class monitor, and those monitors were armed with the 14-inch twin turrets built originally for the Greek battle cruiser Salamis. Churchill never allowed their delivery to the Greek Navy or to Germany. Of course, it was not possible. So then, they were used in arming those monitors for coastal bombardment. Well, at the end of the war, the Ottomans went to war against Russia principally. So the principal enemy in their mind was Russia, and they survived, Russians, in the war. They were on the they were on the peace treaty table in 1917 at Brest-Litovsk. So they won the part of the war that they fought against Russians, but they were defeated because Russia was not the only power they were fighting against. Interestingly, or not so interestingly, the armistice was concluded in the Mudros Bay on the 13th of October 1918. Only a day after the 4th anniversary of the Black Sea raid of the Ottoman or German cruisers. And 5 years later, on that day, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed again on the 29th. I met a historian who suggests that these were not simply coincidences. These were deliberately picked dates. This is just a speculation. The Ottoman representative at Mudros was Captain Mehmet Rauf Orbay, who was the Minister of Marine. And incidentally, he was the commander designate of the Ottoman Sultan Osman Dreadnought. So, the same figures keep coming up. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for bearing with me, ladies and gentlemen.